When the smoke cleared after the gunfight at the OK Corral, the real battle had just begun. Not with bullets, but with words. Under oath and on the record, Wyatt Earp finally let loose his unfiltered thoughts about Ike Clanton and the Cowboy gang. What he said was scathing, dramatic, and reveals more about the Wild West's most famous feud than any dime novel ever could. So saddle up as we dig into Wyatt Earp's own testimony, his version of the truth behind Tombstone's most dangerous men. If you love Old West history, unsolved legends, and real words from real gunslingers, hit that subscribe button and ride with us into the past. On November 16, 1881, during the hearing for the case mentioned above, testimony was taken from Wyatt Earp and John H. Holliday. At that point in the proceedings, the prosecution had presented its main evidence. The two defendants, Earp and Holliday, were informed of their right to make a formal statement under Section 133, page 22 of the Arizona laws approved on February 12, 1881. Wyatt Earp chose to speak under oath and answered questions directly. When asked to identify himself, he responded, "My name is Wyatt Earp. I turned 32 on March 19th of this year." He stated that he was born in Monmouth, Warren County, Illinois, and had been living in Tombstone, Cochise County, Arizona, since December 1st, 1879. Regarding his profession, Earp said that he was currently working as a saloon keeper. He also had experience serving as a deputy sheriff and working in a detective capacity. When invited to clarify any points raised in earlier testimony and to share any facts that might explain his actions, Wyatt Earp began by addressing an incident that had its roots in the spring of the previous year. He recalled that he and others, including his brothers Virgil and Morgan, along with Marshal Williams, Captain Joseph H. Hurst, and 4 soldiers, had followed the trail of 6 government-owned mules that had gone missing from Camp Rucker. Their investigation led them to the McClory Ranch, which was owned by Tom and Frank McClory and located near Charleston. While in Charleston, Earp encountered a man named Dave Estes. Estes informed him that the mules had recently been at the McClory Ranch and that someone had rebranded them using the initials D.S. Earp explained that the branding was altered in a way to disguise the animals' original markings. Upon arrival at the ranch, the group confirmed that the mules were indeed there, and they even found the branding iron used. At the ranch, another man named Frank Patterson reportedly negotiated a compromise with Captain Hurst. According to Earp, Hurst returned to their group and said that the compromise would lead to the return of the mules. Though the Earps were eager to continue pursuing the matter, Hurst persuaded them to return to Tombstone, believing the issue was resolved. However, several weeks later, Captain Hurst informed them that the agreement had not been honored. He said the mules were not returned and that the promise had only been made to get Earp and his party to leave the area. Hurst warned Wyatt and his brothers to remain cautious, as there were rumors that certain individuals involved in the matter had made troubling statements about them. About a month after we had investigated the missing government mules, I ran into Frank and Tom McClory in Charleston. The encounter was tense. They confronted me and warned that if I ever pursued them that closely again, there would be serious consequences. Not long afterward, around the time of the Benson's stagecoach robbery that tragically resulted in the death of Bud Philpott, I was assisting Wells Fargo and Company in a detective role. Based on the investigation, I became convinced that 3 men, Billy Leonard, Harry Head, and James Crane, had been involved in the robbery. From what I knew, those 3 individuals had strong personal and social ties with the Clantons and McClorys. They frequently stayed at the Clanton and McClory ranches, which were widely rumored to be safe havens for individuals involved in outlaw activities. At the time, I had aspirations to run for sheriff of Cocos County in the upcoming election. Capturing those responsible for the stage robbery, particularly those linked to Philpott's death, would earn the respect of both the public and local business leaders. There was a reward of about $1,200 for each of the 3 men, totaling roughly $3,600. That was a significant sum, and I believed it might persuade others to help me locate them. I arranged a private conversation with Ike Clanton, Frank McClory, and Joe Hill behind the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone. I explained my goal: to apprehend Leonard, Head, and Crane, and that doing so would support my candidacy for sheriff. I also promised that if they gave me reliable information, they would receive the full reward, and I would keep their involvement completely confidential. Ike Clanton expressed interest. He said he had a personal dispute with Leonard over a property claim and would benefit if Leonard was no longer in the picture. However, Clanton warned that the men would likely resist arrest and asked if the reward would still be paid if the suspects could not be taken alive. To clarify the terms, I reached out to Marshall Williams, the Wells Fargo agent in town. At my request, he sent a telegram to company leadership in San Francisco. In June 1881, he received a reply confirming that the reward would indeed be paid, regardless of whether the suspects were brought in alive. The following day, I met Clanton and Hill on Allen Street, near a cigar shop beside the Alhambra. I asked Marshall Williams for the telegram, and when he couldn't locate the original, he obtained a fresh copy from the telegraph office. I then showed this message to Clanton and Hill and later shared its contents with Frank McClory. We came to an agreement. They would receive the entire reward, minus basic expenses like horse rentals. Joe Hill was to travel to New Mexico, near Eureka, where Leonard, Head, and Crane were believed to be hiding. His job was to lure them back toward the McClory Ranch, close to Soldiers' Holes, about 30 miles from Tombstone. I would then arrive with a posse to make the arrest. When I asked them how they planned to convince the men to come back, they told me they intended to spread a story about a paymaster traveling between Tombstone and Bisbee to distribute miners' wages. They thought this would tempt Leonard and his group to return. Before departing, Joe Hill left his personal items, a watch, a chain, and a few $100s, with Virgil Earp for safekeeping. He was gone for about 10 days. When he returned, he explained he had arrived too late. Leonard and Head had already been killed, reportedly by horse thieves. Later, I found out those horse thieves may have actually been associated with the Clanton and McClory crowd, suggesting possible internal conflicts or secret reprisals. After this, the relationship between us and the Clantons and McClorys deteriorated. Ike Clanton and Frank McClory began accusing me of sharing the plan with Marshall Williams and Doc Holliday, which wasn't true. They started avoiding us around town, and tensions began rising. From that point on, my brothers Virgil and Morgan, Doc Holliday, and I began hearing troubling remarks suggesting that Clanton and his allies were harboring resentment and making threats behind the scenes. I was a friend of Doc Holliday because, back when I served as city marshal of Dodge City, Kansas, he once came to my aid during a particularly dangerous moment. I was surrounded and outnumbered, and he stepped in and may well have saved my life. About a month before the events that followed, around October 1881, Morgan Earp and I assisted in arresting Pete Spence and Frank Stillwell in connection with the Bisbee stagecoach robbery. Although we were acting as part of a legal posse organized by the sheriff, the Clantons and McClorys blamed us personally for the arrests. Not long after bringing Spence and Stillwell into town, Ike Clanton and Frank McClory arrived. Frank pulled Morgan aside in front of the Alhambra Saloon, where John Ringo, Ike Clanton, and the Hicks brothers were also gathered. Frank harshly criticized Morgan for taking part in the arrest and declared he would no longer associate with Spence due to the incident. Frank then warned Morgan not to attempt to arrest him, implying that things wouldn't go smoothly if that ever happened. Morgan replied that if there was ever legal cause, he would do his duty. Frank responded that although he had previously retracted past threats due to this latest event, those retractions no longer stood. Morgan said nothing further and walked away. Both before and after that incident, several townspeople, including Marshall Williams, Farmer Daly, Ed Barnes, Charlie Smith, and others, told us that they had heard troubling remarks about possible harm being directed toward us. The people reportedly making these statements included Ike Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, Joe Hill, and John Ringo. I was aware that many of these men had reputations for being associated with individuals involved in cattle rustling, stagecoach theft, and other illegal acts. I personally knew about the case where 6 government mules were located at the McClory Ranch. I also heard of cattle being discovered there under suspicious circumstances, When the rightful owner came looking for his livestock, he was driven off and warned not to speak about it. Out of fear, he remained silent until just a few days ago. In addition, I heard about an incident involving John Ringo near Camp Thomas, in which someone was reportedly shot without provocation. I also suspected, based on what I had learned, that the McClory brothers had taken part in attacks on Mexican traders in Skeleton Canyon earlier that summer. Given all of this, I remained cautious and alert. I had no intention of confronting anyone if I could avoid it, but I also wasn't going to let myself be caught off guard. Roughly 5 or 6 weeks ago, I met Ike Clanton near the Alhambra Saloon. He confronted me, claiming I had told Doc Holliday about our earlier discussions regarding the plan to capture Leonard Head and Crane. I told him directly that I had never spoken to Holliday about it, and that when Holliday returned from Tucson, I could prove it. When Holliday came back, I asked him whether he had repeated any of that information to Ike. That night, October 25th, Holliday encountered Ike Clanton at the Alhambra Saloon and questioned him. They began arguing, each accusing the other of not telling the truth. I was eating at the lunch counter inside when I overheard the disagreement. Morgan Earp was nearby at the bar. Knowing he was an officer, I called him over and let him know that Holliday and Clanton were quarreling. He went through the lunch counter area, took Holliday by the arm, and led him outside. Ike Clanton followed shortly after. As I finished my meal and stepped outside, the two men were still exchanging words. Virgil Earp arrived around that time, likely from the Occidental Saloon, and told them firmly that if they didn't stop, he would have to arrest them. The crowd dispersed. Morgan walked toward the Oriental Saloon. Ike crossed the street to the Grand Hotel. I then returned to the Eagle Brewery, where I had been running a faro game. After a short time, I stepped outside again and encountered Ike Clanton. He asked if I would walk with him, saying he wanted to speak privately. I agreed, but told him I couldn't go far, as I had responsibilities with the money from the game. We walked down 5th Street, stopping halfway alongside the brewery. There he told me that when Holliday had approached him earlier that night, he felt unprepared to respond. He said that by morning things would be different, and implied that long-standing tensions had reached a point where they needed to be settled. I told him plainly that I had no interest in conflict and would avoid it if I could, because as I said then, there's no money in it. He left me after that, saying, "I'll be ready for you in the morning." I walked over to the Oriental Saloon. Ike Clanton followed me inside and had a drink. He made a point of displaying his revolver openly. He told me in no uncertain terms that I shouldn't assume things were over, that he intended to confront us the next morning. He also said he'd be glad to settle matters with Doc Holliday right then and there. I told him that Holliday wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to clear the air and show that he hadn't been spreading rumors. Around that time, the man dealing my faro game closed it for the night and brought me the money. I secured it in the safe and headed home. On my way, I crossed paths with Holliday between the Oriental and the Alhambra. We walked together down Allen Street. He turned in for the night, and I continued to my house and went to bed. I didn't get up until around noon on October 26th. Before I even got out of bed, Ned Boyle came by and told me he had just spoken with Ike Clanton near the telegraph office. Ned said Ike was armed and making threats. He claimed that as soon as any of us Earps showed ourselves in the street, something serious was going to start. According to Ned, Ike was saying he and his group were here for a fight and actively looking for us. I stayed in bed for a little while after that, but eventually got up and made my way to the Oriental. Not long after, Harry Jones came to me, clearly concerned. He asked what was going on. I asked what he meant. He said Ike Clanton was walking around armed with both a rifle and a revolver, apparently searching for us. I told him I would go find Clanton and see what he wanted. At the corner of 5th and Allen, I ran into Virgil Earp, who was acting marshal at the time. He had also heard that Ike was actively looking for us. We went in separate directions. Virgil went down 5th toward Fremont, and I went along Allen. Virgil found Ike Clanton on 4th Street, just off Fremont, near an alley. As I was coming down 4th Street myself, I saw Virgil confronting Ike. Ike shifted his rifle as if to raise it, and Virgil quickly reacted, grabbed it, and used his revolver to subdue him. Not to injure, but to bring him under control. Clanton had the rifle in his hands and a revolver tucked into his waistband. By the time I reached them, Virgil and Morgan had already taken Ike's weapons. They escorted him to the Grand Hotel, where they examined his gear, and then I took Ike Clanton before Justice Wallace. Since Virgil was out looking for Judge Wallace at that time, Morgan temporarily had Ike in custody. I went into the courtroom and took a seat. From his bench, Ike looked over at me and said something like, "I'll get back at all of you for this." He added that if he had a weapon at that moment, he would settle it right then. Morgan replied calmly, saying that if Ike was so eager to act, he'd hand him his own revolver. As Morgan offered it, Ike began to rise, but Deputy Sheriff Campbell intervened, telling him to stay seated and stating he wouldn't allow any further disturbance. I want to clarify that I never handled Ike Clanton's weapons at any point, despite claims to the contrary. To describe our positions in the courtroom, Ike was sitting on a bench facing north. I sat along the north wall directly in front of him. Morgan was standing just to my right with his back to the same wall, holding Clanton's Winchester rifle by the barrel, with one end resting on the floor. He had the revolver in his other hand. The weapons remained with us the entire time. Virgil was not in the room during this. He arrived later after I had already left. Virgil told me afterward that he'd been out trying to locate Judge Wallace. At that point, I was growing increasingly concerned. I had heard numerous threats from Ike and his associates, and their behavior that day made it feel like something serious was being planned. I had no desire for violence, but I also couldn't ignore what seemed like an ongoing and deliberate threat to my life and the safety of my brothers. I came to believe that if a confrontation was inevitable, I wanted it to happen openly and directly, not by surprise or ambush. So I turned to Ike, who was sitting roughly 8 feet away, and said, "You've been making these threats for some time now. I know what's been said. If you really want to settle this, I'll face you anytime, any place, even if it means riding over to San Simon, into your own territory." Ike replied calmly, "I'll see you after I'm done here. All I need is 4 feet of ground." After leaving the courtroom near the justice's office, I encountered Tom McClory just outside. He approached and said that if I wanted a confrontation, he was willing to meet me anywhere. I assumed he had overheard my earlier exchange with Ike Clanton. Given Tom's past threats against me, I felt the same way about him as I did about Ike. If a confrontation was truly unavoidable, I figured it was better to face it under circumstances where I could defend myself fairly. So I told him, "If that's how you feel, then let's settle it here." At that moment, I reached out and struck him lightly with my left hand to provoke a reaction and drew my pistol with my right, more as a warning than a challenge. Tom had a revolver visibly tucked into his waistband, but he didn't make any move to use it. I told him plainly, "If you intend to act, now's the time." Still, he did nothing, and I tapped him on the head with the barrel of my revolver, again, more to deter than to injure, and walked away, heading toward Hafford's corner. I stepped inside, picked up a cigar, and stood by the door for a moment. Shortly after, I saw Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton walking down 4th Street toward a gunsmith shop. Curious about their intentions, I followed them. When I got there, I noticed Frank McClory's horse was standing on the sidewalk, its head sticking into the doorway of the shop. As a deputy city marshal, it was my responsibility to maintain order, so I took the horse by the bridle and began backing it off the walkway. At that point, Tom, Frank, and Billy Clanton came to the door. Billy rested his hand near his revolver, and Frank tried to take hold of the horse's reins. I told him clearly, "You need to move this horse off the sidewalk." He complied and backed it into the street. Just then, Ike Clanton arrived, and all 4 of them went inside the shop. From where I stood, I could see them rearranging the ammunition in their belts. They exited the shop and walked down 4th Street to the corner of Allen, then continued on toward Dunbar's Corral. I followed them to the intersection of 4th and Allen, but stopped there. At that time, Virgil Earp was serving as Tombstone City Marshal, and Morgan Earp had been working as a special officer for the past 6 weeks or so. He wore a badge and received regular pay. I had been deputized to serve in Virgil's place while he was in Tucson for the Spence and Stillwell trial. Although Virgil had returned several days earlier, I was still assisting him with duties around town. I believe Virgil would soon have to disarm the group based on their behavior and ongoing threats toward us. I followed to be nearby in case help was needed. Roughly 10 minutes later, while Virgil, Morgan, Doc Holliday, and I were standing on the corner of 4th and Allen Streets, people began warning us that something was likely to happen. One man, Coleman, told Virgil directly, "They mean trouble. They've just left Dunbar's Corral and gone into the OK Corral, all carrying weapons. You'd better go disarm them." Virgil turned to us, Doc, Morgan, and me, and asked us to go with him to disarm the group. Morgan then suggested that, since the Clantons and McClorys had horses, we might need horses ourselves in case the situation escalated into a pursuit. I told him that wouldn't be necessary. If they tried to escape, I said, we could stop their horses and then detain them. So the four of us began walking through 4th Street toward Fremont. As we rounded the corner, we spotted several men near the vacant lot between Fly's photography studio and the adjacent building. I first noticed Frank and Tom McClory, Billy Clanton, and Sheriff Johnny Bain among them. We continued down the left-hand side of Fremont Street. When we were about 150 feet away, I could see Ike and Billy Clanton standing with a few others. As we moved closer, Sheriff Bain separated from the group and began walking toward us. Every few steps, he looked over his shoulder, clearly uneasy. I heard him say to Virgil, "For God's sake, don't go down there. You'll be killed." Virgil, who was leading us, responded calmly, "I'm going to disarm them." When Morgan and I reached Bain, he told us, "I have already disarmed them." Upon hearing this, I lowered my pistol, which I had been holding under my coat, and placed it in my overcoat pocket. Behan continued walking up the street, and we proceeded toward the group. When we got close, we saw Frank McClory, Tom McClory, and Billy Clanton lined up against the eastern side of the building, just west of Fly's gallery. Ike Clanton, Billy Claiborne, and another man I didn't recognize were standing in the middle of the vacant lot between the buildings. As we approached, I noticed that Billy Clanton and both Frank and Tom McClory had their hands down at their sides. The revolvers belonging to Frank McClory and Billy Clanton were clearly visible. Wyatt Earp stepped forward and firmly instructed them, "Raise your hands. I've come to disarm you." Instead of complying, Billy and Frank placed their hands on their revolvers. Virgil quickly clarified, "Wait, I don't mean to start anything. We're only here to disarm you." Despite the warning, Billy and Frank began drawing their weapons. At the same time, Tom McClory moved his hand toward his hip and opened his coat, revealing what appeared to be a firearm. He quickly stepped behind a nearby horse, which I later realized belonged to Billy Clanton. My own revolver was still in my overcoat pocket, where I had placed it earlier after Sheriff Behan claimed to have disarmed the group. But when I saw Billy Clanton and Frank McClory reach for their weapons, I immediately retrieved mine. Billy aimed in my direction, though I did not return fire at him. I had heard that Frank McClory was particularly skilled with firearms and had a reputation for being dangerous. My attention was focused on him, and I aimed accordingly. Billy Clanton and I fired at nearly the same moment. It's unclear who shot first, but the exchange happened almost simultaneously. From there, the confrontation escalated quickly. Within moments, Ike Clanton rushed toward me and grabbed my left arm. He didn't appear to be armed, and I assumed he wasn't. I told him plainly, "The fight's already begun. Either get involved or step aside," and I pushed him away with my left hand. Ike took off running and disappeared between the nearby lodging house and the photo studio. My first shot struck Frank McClory in the abdomen. Though he staggered, he managed to fire back at me. When we first called out for the group to surrender their weapons, Billy Claiborne raised one hand and immediately fled. I didn't see him again until much later that afternoon, well after everything had ended. For the record, I didn't draw my firearm, or even move to do so, until after Billy Clanton and Frank McClory had already drawn theirs. As for Tom McClory, if he was not armed, I wasn't aware of it. Based on what I saw and what had been communicated to me beforehand, I had every reason to believe he was carrying a weapon. I was also told he had made threats against us in the past. I believed he fired at us before Doc Holliday, who was holding a shotgun, responded and struck him. I never aimed or fired at Ike Clanton during the entire event because I believed he was unarmed. That decision was intentional. Looking back, and even at the time, I believed strongly that Ike, Tom and Frank had planned a coordinated attack against my brothers, Doc Holliday and me. The threats, the behavior, and the gathering of armed individuals all suggested something serious was underway. Even so, I did not take preemptive action. Despite believing I would have been justified, both legally and morally, in defending myself before any shots were fired, I chose to act only when it became clear there was no other option. We were there to fulfill our duties as lawmen, and I was acting under Virgil's command, who was the city marshal. I had no intention of starting a fight unless it became absolutely necessary in defense of our lives and the safety of others. Once Billy Clanton and Frank McClory pulled their weapons, I knew there was no turning back. It became a matter of survival for me, my brothers, and Doc Holliday. I've lived in Tombstone since December 1st, 1879, having come directly from Dodge City, Kansas. Before that, I resigned as city marshal in Dodge City despite opposition from local leaders and business owners. I had served as a police officer in Wichita starting in 1874 before moving west. As for Ike Clanton's claim that I was somehow involved in any stagecoach robbery or that I ever passed along information to help any criminal activity, it is completely false. His account is a fabrication from beginning to end, and none of it reflects the truth of my actions or intentions. Sheriff John Bayan once approached me with a private proposal in his office, which was located in the back room of a cigar store on Allen Street. He offered that if I would step aside and not seek the appointment for sheriff of Cochise County, he would hire a clerk and split the earnings of the office with me. I agreed to his terms and made no further attempt to gain the position, but after that meeting, Bayan never brought the subject up again. Later in his official statement, he provided reasons for backing out of our agreement, but every part of his explanation was untrue. On one occasion, Doc Holliday and I traveled to Charleston on the same evening that Bayan went down there to serve a subpoena on Ike Clanton. Our reason for being in Charleston had nothing to do with the subpoena. We had come to recover a horse that had been stolen from me not long after I arrived in Tombstone. I had received information suggesting the Clanton group had the horse. When I reached Charleston that evening, a reliable source told me that the man who had just delivered a message from Charleston to Ike Clanton's ranch had ridden the horse in question. At that time, I didn't know where Clanton's ranch was located. A short while later, while I was in the Huachuca Mountains working on some water right claims, I began my return trip to Tombstone. When I got within about a dozen miles of Charleston, I ran into a man named McMasters. He told me that if I hurried, I might still catch sight of my missing horse in town. When I arrived in Charleston, I spotted the horse being led down the street toward a corral. I decided to stay the night at a different corral nearby. I then went to Burnett's office to request official documents that would allow me to reclaim the horse, but Burnett was out of town. He had gone to Sonora to look into a coal discovery, so I sent a telegram to my brother James Earp in Tombstone, asking him to arrange for the paperwork. He contacted Judge Wallace and Mr. Street, and they prepared the necessary documents. That same evening, my youngest brother, Warren Earp, brought the papers to me in Charleston. While I was still waiting, Billy Clanton learned that I was in town. He tried to take the horse from the corral, but I stopped him and told him the horse belonged to me. Once the official paperwork arrived, he surrendered the animal willingly, without requiring the documents to be served. Before leaving, Billy Clanton sarcastically asked if I had any more horses to lose. I replied that I planned to keep them in the stable from now on, so he wouldn't get another opportunity to take one. As part of my official statement, I also included a document that was sent to me from Dodge City after my arrest in this case. I requested that it be attached to this record and labeled as Exhibit A. At this point, the prosecution objected to the inclusion of the paper, arguing that it was not a personal statement of mine, but rather a letter from others written long after the events in question. In response, my defense objected to any such interruption of a statutory statement made by a person accused of a crime. The law intends that such a statement be free from interference, whether by the court or opposing counsel, and should stand as valid evidence of the person's character, even without formalities. The court overruled the prosecution's objection and allowed the document to be filed as part of my official statement. I had multiple conversations, 4 or 5 in total, with Ike Clanton, Frank McClory, and Joe Hill. All of these discussions took place in the backyard area behind the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone. During one of those talks, I told Ike Clanton that there were some individuals around town speaking poorly of Doc Holliday. People were beginning to suspect that he might have had some involvement in the attempted stagecoach robbery and the tragic death of Bud Philpott. I explained to Ike that if I could capture the suspects, Leonard, Head, and Crane, I would be able to clear Holliday's name by proving he had no connection to the crime. As for our pursuit of Leonard, Head, and Crane, we picked up their trail directly from the site of the attempted robbery. From that point on, we followed nearly every step without losing the trail, starting from Drew's Ranch on the San Pedro River and tracking them all the way to Helms Ranch in the Dragoon Mountains. At one point during the manhunt, after traveling around 80 miles along the San Pedro, we managed to capture one of the men, King, who was believed to be traveling with the main group. From there, we followed their tracks across the Catalina Mountains, passing within 15 miles of Tucson. Then the trail led us back to Tres Alamos on the San Pedro River, and finally eastward again to Helms Ranch in the Dragoons. It's important to clarify that their trail never led south from Helms Ranch, as Ike Clanton later claimed. Instead, after reaching Helms, the suspects tried to cover their movement by stealing 15 to 20 head of livestock, hoping to make their trail harder to follow. Despite that, we continued the pursuit. Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, Robert H. Paul, who was then sheriff of Pima County, Johnny Bayan, the sheriff of Cochise County, Deputy Sheriff Breckenridge, and a few others followed the trail all the way into New Mexico. We committed every resource and effort we had in trying to apprehend them. I personally was out on the trail for 10 days. Virgil and Morgan were in the field for over 2 weeks. I can say with confidence that if it hadn't been for Morgan and me, we wouldn't have caught King. When we found his hiding place, he attempted to flee toward a dense patch of brush along the river. It was only our quick response that stopped him from getting away. Wyatt Earp's testimony wasn't just a defense. It was a window into the deep mistrust, tangled alliances, and explosive tensions that defined Tombstone in the early 1880s. The names Clanton, McClory, and Ringo didn't just represent individuals. They symbolized the blurred line between outlaw and rancher, lawman and vigilante. And that, folks, is the Old West. Gritty, complicated, and anything but simple. If you enjoyed this journey through the sworn words of Wyatt Earp, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories, forgotten testimonies, and raw facts from the American frontier. Saddle up. There's plenty more trail ahead.